I thought to myself, what I'll do is talk about my time on Yallalong Station. I spent 2 weeks as station pilot. I got a phone call out of the blue from a person who I'd only briefly met a couple of times, and he asked me if I was interested in taking over from him for 2 weeks on the station while he had a holiday. And I was studying for my commercial licence at the time and only had about 70 hours, and I needed 3 times that number to get up to the requirement for a commercial licence. And so I said yes, and off I went to Yallalong Station, 75 nautical miles north of Mullawar, which was the nearest town. So that's a location that, just to reinforce, 130 kilometres or 75 miles to the property. My arrival at the station was brought about by the current pilot flying the aircraft to Jannagot for service, whereupon he got out, the service was done, I got in on my own, flew up to the station, landed and introduced myself to the owner of the station. And he said to me almost straight away, listen, we've got a job to do. I've got to get into Mullawar, and so let's have a quick lunch and we'll be on our way. So we flew via another station into Mullawar. He'd made another phone call, and the bank manager or a representative from the bank was at the airport at Mullawar, drove us into town, and they said, well, we'll be in conference for a while at the bank, and you can please yourself. So I wandered around the metropolis of Mullawar. I bought a Time magazine and sat in the corner of the pub with a soft drink. I then started to think about when we were going to get away. So I put an equation together that I had a rough guess at last light. I thought, well, I've got to be on the ground at last light. I need to give myself a buffer. So I took 20 minutes off that. And then I knew that it was 45 minutes flight time to the station, so I took that into account. And I gave myself 15 minutes to get from the pub in Mullawar to the airport and get airborne. And so that from that I deduced a departure time. I found the taxi driver in the town and said to him, could you be at the hotel at 5 o'clock? Because I really must get away at the very latest at 5 o'clock. So he said, yep, that's all right. So mid to late afternoon, the people came out of the bank and a few of them ended up at the bar. And when it was getting close to departure time, I went out and said to the taxi driver, well, you know, we really should be thinking of moving almost any minute. And then he asked a few questions and found out who was inside. And I said, it's the owner of Yallalong Station. And he said, I've got to have a beer with him. The taxi driver went in, and I was being treated like a bad smell. I was hovering around and saying, let's go. And they say, no, we're all right. It's still early, there's lots of light and sun around. I say, no. But anyway, eventually we got going. Halfway home, we did a fix on Tallering Peak. And I said, well, we're on track for the station. It's getting dark. And the station owner held his arm out and said, I can normally fit 4 fingers between the sun and the horizon when we get here. And that's for a late arrival. But tonight I can only get 2 fingers between the sun and the horizon. Here we go. So as time went on, the visibility in the distance started to go. And I found that I could see vertically down. And I got the contrast between the scrub and the lighter vegetation that was there, animal fodder. And so before I went up there, I worked in the lands department and had access to aerial photography. I made a big study of the area, particularly in the area of the homestead, and I knew there was a very strange bend in the river quite close to the homestead. So I intercepted the river and tracked as it was getting as dark as humanly possible and came to this bend. And I could only recognise it because as the water scoured around it, it left some of the sandy component very, very light in colour compared to everything else that was there. And so that was the station, and that's the bend in the river that I had in my mind. And so I got to that and tracked into the runway there, and by this time the light had completely gone. There was no afterglow, no light in the sky, and I had to turn on the landing light of the aircraft and hunt on the way in, looking by raising and lowering the beam and moving it side to side. Finally, the runway came into view and I conducted a night landing. It just happened to be the first night landing I'd ever done. When I turned the aircraft around on the runway, I still had to have the light on, landing light on, to taxi back. I had to search from side to side of the runway and then get it all home. And so that was my introduction to Yallalong Station. This is a photo of the hangar at the station with the Cessna 172 in it. There's a pole standing up there which you can see, but you can't see a ring that was hanging down below it. Also, you may be able to just see something vertical on the roof of the hangar there. Yep. It was never discussed with me, even though I asked questions about it, but I became suspicious that the previous pilot had rigged up a homing device to radio, and he also had a light that he could turn on for night arrivals. So I think that I wasn't the first to do a night landing at the station. As well as taking that photograph on my first couple of days there, I took that one, which was the homestead. I went back about a year later and things had improved quite a lot, but that was the homestead. That was the front door at a later time. It took me a few days to work out who was on the station and what they did. Under the main roof lived the station owner and his wife and a daughter and a son. The daughter was about 16, maybe 17, and the son was about 12 years of age. He was cut out to be a station owner, and he taught sheep and how to keep them going. The lady of the house was very busy at all times. She was conducting the correspondence lessons for the children, as well as looking after the household. So she was a lovely person and very, very busy at all times throughout the day. Also living under the main roof when they were there was the station pilot and his wife, and she was a very useful character and a very nice person as well. I met her a number of times afterwards. On the station was the station shooter. He was keeping the vermin and the unwanted animals numbers down, and he was living away from the main homestead with his wife and daughter. His daughter was about 16 or 17, and she accompanied him on pretty well all of his excursions out to deal with animals. A very, very nice girl. I never saw them all at once, but I understood there was 4 or 5 stockmen on the property. There was also a number of wives, maybe as many as the stockmen, or maybe 3 or 4, and a number of children. There was no stockman's award, and so the Aborigines got free food, the essentials, and they got a small amount of money entered in a ledger. So at virtually any time they could work out what they were worth. We didn't think of it as a bank balance. Records were kept of what they took from what was called the shop. which was adjacent to the office, and the owner and his wife and the daughter spent a fair bit of time in the office as well. I think the shooter had some sort of contract with the owner in that he was getting a retainer, and he also had a contract or something going with pets packs, and he would shoot the animals, butcher them in the bush, and put them into a chiller room that he had, which was mobile, and when he had enough meat he'd arrange for it to come to Perth. Stockman, day-to-day operations, checking fences, mills and so on. A lot of banging used to go on in the sheds and so on, repairing things. One day I was asked to take an Aborigine out to look for some sheep. Just prior to my arrival, I'd sheared sheep from one paddock, fairly big paddock, a mile or two by a mile or two. So I flew out with this Aborigine who knew the countryside, knew where he was, and pointed. As he pointed, he used to say, "Over here, boss, over there, boss, down a bit, boss, up a bit." So I was boss. And I called him mate. "Okay, mate, we can handle all that." So eventually he saw these sheep and asked me to fly around them. And he did a count, and he said, "I reckon there's 250 there, maybe 300. And that was good news to the station owner, because he was quite sure that the muster wasn't very efficient. I commented on the skill of this person who was sitting alongside of me later on, and the station owner said, "Oh, that was Friday that went with you." And I said, "Friday? Was that his name?" And he said, yeah, Friday Dingo." So his wife was Mrs. Dingo and his kids were little dingoes. There were quite a number of station buildings to keep the show on the road, and that was one of them that I took in my first visit. That's the shearing shed, and that was the accommodation, I think, which was used by the Aborigines. There were two very similar in appearance. One was for the shearers and the other one was for the Aborigines. I wasn't there long before they started to talk about bush turkey. And they said, "Have you ever tried a bush turkey?" I said, "No, I don't even know what one is." And they said, "Wow, it's beautiful meat." So I went out with the shooter, and he shot one of these turkeys, wild turkeys. It was about so high, had a long neck. He had a rifle which was a .32 or
Winchester 32.
32. Anyway, he knew what to do with this. He got the turkey in the middle of its neck, and the top of the neck just fell over, and the bird fell to the ground. It was so big that they could only cook it in the shearers' quarters. The oven there was the biggest on the premises. So they had this special night where the shooter and his wife and his daughter and the owner and his wife and kids came along, and this was put on for Brian, and they saved a drumstick from this animal for me. That was the toughest meat I've ever tasted. So I had to go along with it and say, yeah, that's lovely, isn't it? But while we're talking about meat, breakfast was lamb chops, lunch was a lamb dish or cold lamb, and the evening meal was a leg of lamb. And after 2 weeks, all I wanted to do was have some fish or a steak. There was additional accommodation there for visitors, and I assumed that visitors were welcome at all times. They lived a lonely sort of life, and to have someone else on the premises and to entertain them was something I looked forward to. They looked after me very well as well. Of course, that was the name of the game. One of the earlier shots of the homestead with the red roof, and a truck there for the wool to be transported away. That was a later photograph, a different truck, but that was the wool. I remember the station owner saying at one stage that he had 20,000 sheep, and I'm only guessing these numbers, but the numbers were quite high. He reckoned he had about 5,000 donkeys and 4,000 goats and a few hundred horses, etc. And he said, and they're all trying to eat my fodder, which I'm saving up for the sheep. But anyway, that was what was on the property. That was the name of the game. Later photographs showed that they'd actually spent some time working away at the garden, and a little bit of water did good. But this is a photograph that I picked up off the internet, and that's the station in 2011 after, I think, the highest water they'd had ever on the station. From the initial photo that I showed you, there have been some changes. Down in this direction was the bend that I'd familiarised myself with to end up on the approach to that runway, and the long runway, which was in the previous photograph, early photograph, was that one there. And so what they'd done was they'd built 2 more runways. Goodness only knows why. It didn't seem that they were necessary. In the setup there's the homestead, and there's the shearing shed. And that would be devastating to have the whole homestead over waist high in water. Just imagine walking into your kitchen with the water up to your midriff. They used horses rarely to move around the property. In fact, I was thinking that some of the stockmen there didn't really know how to ride a horse. They certainly knew how to ride a motorbike. There was about half a dozen of them there, and they moved like the wind. So a couple of things in the background were that the pilot, who was normally there with his wife, as I have said was a very nice lady, she spent a fair bit of time, evidently, with the Aboriginal women and children, teaching them the basics of reading and writing. And from what I learned later on, the ladies, or the Aboriginal ladies there, were probably the best dressed I'd ever come across. They were very nice people. And so that was a station that was run before the government in Canberra, in their wisdom, under Mr. Whitlam, brought in the idea that there should be a stockman's award, and this changed the world. The Aborigines could check on the ledger to find out how much money they had. They would then, on occasions, borrow the truck and drive into Mullawar, where they'd spend the best part of a week associating with their friends and relations and spending some money. Then they'd return to the property, and one of the very strict rules was there was no alcohol on the property at all. And so these Aborigines used to stop at the gate and consume the alcohol. Sometimes the stops were a matter of minutes, and some of them went on to a number of days. I've got to sum it all up that I went to the station knowing nothing about station life and Aborigines, and I came away with a pretty good knowledge of how that station worked. I had a pretty good knowledge of how lucky the Aborigines were that were on that property, because the owner did it right by them. Since then, the Stockman's Award has resulted in the Aboriginal population of that station and many others just disappearing to what you'd call zero. Thank you.